Leading Britain's conversation, Cross Question, with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. Welcome to Cross Question, LBC's thrice-weekly political panel debate show. I'm Iain Dale. Joining us tonight, we have the former Secretary of State for Defence, Sir Michael Fallon. We have Sarkar from Novara Media. We have Petronella Wyatt, the author and broadcaster, and award-winning author and historian, Sir Richard Evans. They're here to take your calls. The lines are open now. Lots of good calls coming through. 0345 6060 973. And if you've never watched us as opposed to listen to us, you can do that too on Global Player, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, or on the LBC YouTube, Facebook or Twitter feeds.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first caller. It's Tanya in Hackney. Hello, Tanya.
Hi there, good evening. I have a question for the panel. I wondered if you could tell me why you think that these articles comparing white working class kids with ethnic minorities, but not middle class kids. There's not a word about middle class kids, and I wondered why that might be.
Well, this is in the light of the Education Select Committee report, which came out today, where the chairman of the committee, Robert Halfon, seemed to think that the phrase white privilege had something to do with the reason why white working class kids don't do as well as black working class kids. But the very nuanced question there from Tanya. Richard, let's come to you first.
Yes, I thought you might.
Well, being the one in education.
Well, I think this is a very complicated question with all kinds of different angles to it. And really, I don't think we should get hung up on this white working class, white privilege kind of issue. It's not, the fact is that it's not kids being taught in school that there's such a thing as white privilege, which is causing the white working class kids to be disadvantaged. You need to look at it on a much bigger scale. And other parts of the report, I think, do this. And it's a bit unfortunate, I think, that it's all the controversies focused on this. We need to look at poverty. We need to look at geography. Where are these kids? Where are the schools? Are they good schools? Are they bad schools? There's so many things that need to take into account. I would say we need to look in particular at poverty, government expenditure on schools. Is it enough? Have there been cuts? All these kinds of issues, not just the white privilege slogan, which I think is a bit of a red herring, really.
Why do you think? I mean, Rob Halfon, he's a fairly moderate kind of conservative. I don't see him as somebody who wants to stoke culture wars. Why do you think that has been the one thing that people are going to remember from this?
Yeah, well, I think that's the way the media have treated it, really. They've seized on this, and whether or not he wants to stoke culture wars, I really don't know. It doesn't seem to me to fit in with the rest of what falls under that kind of rubric. And if I were him, I think I would say, look at the other bits of the report as well. Don't just look at this one.
Sarkar, let me come to you. I was talking to Dr. Mary Bowstead from the National Education Union earlier, and I thought she made a really good point that maybe one of the reasons that white working class kids don't do so well is geography in some ways, in that they tend to live in more remote areas, whereas black working class kids tend to live in sort of maybe more urban areas, maybe sort of London in particular, where they can see aspiration. Whereas if you live in a coastal community, which can be very poverty stricken, and you just don't see any way out, you don't have that sense of hope that we all need if we're going to succeed.
You know, I don't think that the problem there is aspiration so much as it is allocation of funding. So schools overall have lost out in the last 10 years. There's been a 9% real terms funding cut per pupil in secondary education. But the worst hit areas are outside of the big cities and in poorer regions in particular. And so those are areas which also tend to be less racially diverse. I do think you've also got some differences in terms of the work that's been put in over the last few decades to address what was once a very racialized disparity in educational outcomes, where where once upon a time it was black working class boys who were being left behind in the education system. There was money put into it, there was training put into it for teachers, and that changed. By the time that you kind of had a levelling out between working class attainment, and indeed you had some kind of cultural factors kicking in terms of some of the values that children of immigrants are raised with kind of kicking in, and you have better educational attainment, you then have the austerity years where just money is being taken out of the system. So I do not buy this argument that white privilege, talking about it, regardless of what you think about it as a concept, has any causal relation on the underachievement of white working class boys. But the reason why the government is talking about it, and why the media has really taken it up like, a Labrador with a frisbee and just run with it, is because it is getting the crabs in the barrel to fight each other. It's creating all these arguments essentially between different parts of the working class, the white working class and the black and Asian working class, to talk about, who's got, the biggest crumb thrown from the table, rather than having a look at what's been going on at the top.
No, I get that, but you do have to look at different groups in society and if there is evidence of one particular group falling behind, it's not unreasonable to ask why that is it?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And that is such a crucial question to address. But that means that you've got to provide serious answers and do serious research. When you have a look at the minutes from this committee, you can see that the talk about white privilege really is quite an ideological imposition. It is not really what the data and the serious scholarship is saying. It's because there's an ideological interest in stoking this culture wars, because then the Conservatives can pretend it's not been them in power for the last 10 years. It's been this imaginary middle-class anti-racist teacher who's been, yelling in the face of some deprived kid going, do you know you've got white privilege? It's a complete fantasy and concoction.
Okay. Michael Fallon, do I recall some time ago you were an education minister?
Far too long ago, I'm afraid, Ian. I was schools minister under Margaret Thatcher, which wasn't for the faint-hearted. And, a lot of things have changed since then. It was a very long time ago. I do agree with Ash and Richard. We shouldn't actually be using words like privilege. I don't think that's helpful. But I don't buy all of Ash's, more political analysis that all this started back in 2010 when the Conservative coalition first came in. There have been funding issues. There were funding issues when I was minister all the way through, because the way in which local education authorities were funded was completely arbitrary. There was overfunding in some areas, underfunding in others, and nobody really had the guts to tackle the formula. And, that is only gradually now being done. So there are winners and losers. That's one point. Second, there has been a huge improvement in education in London. Besides the huge demographic changes that have taken place in London, the London boroughs have improved enormously. And where I think we are seeing particularly white boys slipping behind is, as you said, Ian, in some of the more rural areas, the coastal areas, where there are issues, I'm afraid, of aspiration. Again, I don't quite agree with Ash. I think aspiration, is important. It is important to show there are other futures, beyond simply moving from the local school to the local company to go and work. There are other alternatives. And that's why I think government, has got to, as well as getting more money into education, has got to keep addressing the issue of how you get more parental support, how you encourage aspiration, and how you encourage other routes on after school, particularly in better further education. And just one final point. When I was education minister, I took a bill through Parliament, the Higher Education and Further Education Funding Bill, which actually converted a lot of polytechnics into universities. When it went through the House of Lords, there wasn't a word spoken about further education. It was all about university education, what the Vice-Chancellors wanted, the issues of tenure. Well, apologies, Richard, but that was all the focus there. And we're still behind in addressing the issue of really good, estimable further education in this country as an alternative to the university.
Just as an aside, we talk a lot about vocational education, further education on this show. Do you still believe that turning all those polytechnics into universities was a good idea?
Well, they argue very strongly that they wanted to recruit overseas students, and they couldn't do that unless they had the word university in their title. That was the technical argument that Kenneth Clark and I were confronted with. Now, there are universities like MIT in the United States that don't have the word university in their title, but that was the argument. What we hoped was that they would be different. They would keep some of their differences, the different courses they put on. But what emerged quite quickly after they all became universities is they all started to ape universities. They all got themselves vice-chancellors and gowns and degree ceremonies and started to try and offer exactly the same courses that the traditional universities were offering. So, yes, I do regret a bit of it. And I don't think, and we were as guilty about this as anybody, we paid nearly enough attention to further education, and we're still not doing it.
Petronella, what's your view?
Well, I actually do quite a bit of teaching for an educational charity called Real Action, which is in a very poor part of London. And I think geography does play an enormous part. But I'm afraid so do the educational failures of the state school system and the actual teaching. I'm very worried about white boys. They are falling behind dreadfully. You see this in Real Action classes. You're taking children from state schools who are illiterate because the schools are not actually teaching. If you teach these boys in a disciplined way, they'll learn. But they're not getting the discipline. And I think this is being ignored as something everyone wants to dance around, not talk about. But I've seen this because I do this nearly every Saturday. When you get them disciplined and you go back to, we use something called butterfly method, which is like old-fashioned phonetics, they just whiz ahead. But I also feel that boys as well, boys have an abundance of energy that they need a discipline that they're not getting. And they've largely been ignored. I think white, identical working class boys, poor boys, a lot of their parents, I see that too, they're from the criminal class. Whereas the children from ethnic minorities, that their parents are moving up to the professional class. I think a lot of these white families think that they've been ignored, forgotten about, that they're despised, and that they have no place in this country anymore. I think that's a huge problem.
And Richard, from a university perspective, I mean, you were, when I first met you, you were teaching at UEA, I was a student there, you then moved on to Cambridge. I mean, universities have their issues in terms of the kinds of people that they're bringing in. Do you think that they're making enough of an effort to make sure that they get a diverse range of students, not just from ethnic minorities, but also the kind of kids that we're talking about here? Absolutely, yes.
I mean, between UEA, where I taught you, Ian.
Very well, if I may say so.
Enough of this loving, I think. But between UEA and Cambridge, I was at Birkbeck for many years. It's in London. It's London University's college for part-time mature students. All sorts, all types, a lot of them with very few educational qualifications. And I think one of the things that Birkbeck does so well is show how important lifelong learning is. You don't just stop learning when you get to the age of 21 or 22. It's important to have the infrastructure there with other places like Birkbeck, which will pick, where you can pick up, learn more as you go on, all kinds of different courses and degrees. As far as universities like Cambridge, a very, very different university, are concerned, there I think it's extraordinary what efforts are being made to recruit students who are not posh and to persuade students. I mean, I've given talks in secondary schools, in state secondary schools in East London and Stratford, places like that. It's very difficult to persuade bright students that Cambridge is for them. They say it's not for us. So what universities like Cambridge or Oxford or Manchester or many universities are doing is having courses, often put on by the Sutton Trust, which is a very important educational trust trying to increase the diversity and social range of students at universities. You can come and do a foundation year now. You can get all kinds of help. There are scholarships, all kinds of things you can help. Believe me, universities like Oxford and Cambridge and many others are looking very, very hard to increase the proportion of state students, which they're doing. Not enough, but they're doing, and the proportion of state students at major universities is growing, it's increasing year on year, and also diversity. So it's a symbolic thing, perhaps, but we now have 3 black heads of college in Oxford and Cambridge, and that I think should show the way.
0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 19 minutes past 8 on Cross Question. Let me reintroduce my panel to you. Sir Michael Fallon, the former Defence Secretary, is with us. Ash Sarkar from Novara Media. Sir Richard Evans, historian, and Petronella Wyatt, author and writer. I'm going to ask you, before I read the next question out, which is a text from Shirley in Tunbridge, how many of you are familiar with the dating app Bumble? Michael? Ash? Richard?
No.
Petronella? No. Well, as I understand it, I've done lots of research on this. It is an app where the women basically have to make the first move. And it's very popular, I gather. Well, you were on it, were you?
Yeah, I was. I was always really bad at the apps because I kind of felt like everyone else got this rule book that I didn't, and I didn't understand how to make conversation. So I got Bumble because I thought I make the first move, I'll have a better chance of like getting a date or something. And I arranged one Bumble date and I got stood up. So that tells you how good I was at Bumble.
It's the or something I was worried about there, Ash. Anyway, the question is, Bumble, the dating app, is giving all of its staff a week off work to help them de-stress. Sounds lovely, but wouldn't a 4-day working week be better, says Shelley in Tunbridge. Petronella.
Do we know why their staff
Well, apparently
are so stressed?
they were all burnt out, which I think is a bit odd because I would have thought dating apps haven't done a roaring trade over the last year.
No, they haven't. I mean, the only men I've been meeting have been in supermarket queues. And they're generally between the ages of 65 and 95. I mean, what can you do? I don't go into what you can do online. No, a 4-day working week, it's a dangerous path to go down if we really want to bounce back after COVID. I don't think it's a very good idea to have this default position of people being allowed to work from home almost as much as they want without any penalties whatsoever. I mean, some offices can function that way, but other offices can't. Then we have the problems with, the City of London, the West End. And we don't want these sort of great cultural and economic hubs to become dead because other businesses depend on office workers. Restaurants depend on office workers. Shops depend on office workers. I dread to think what's happening in the Docklands at the moment because its economy, the businesses there, they are dependent on office workers. So in the long run, you're going to get a lot of unemployment, bankrupt businesses. I mean, it's a lovely idea. And in some cases it works, but you cannot introduce something like that across the board without...
Okay. Michael Fallon, a 4-day working week, frankly, I have a 4-day working week and it's the best thing I ever did. I think it's a fantastic thing. But not every sector can cope with that. But then if you look at the trends over the last 20 or 30 years, the trend is to reduced working hours, isn't it? So do you think this is inevitable at some point?
Well, I think certainly the pandemic is going to make everybody, firms as well as employees, look again at their work-life balance. And I think, that is probably no bad thing. The question was from Tunbridge Wells. Should people, forever have to get up?
Tunbridge, Michael, there is a big difference.
Even closer in. But, should people have to get up at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, 5 days a week, slog all the way into the city and back again? I think we'll have to learn lessons from this. And I think companies will want to look at whether the work-life balance needs to be addressed and what that means. If you say to young people, particularly, take some of Petronella's points, but if you take young people, they might be deprived of the experience of learning from older people. If you say to them as interns or new starters, we don't want you in every day. They're the ones who really have missed out over the last year and a half and so on, of the culture of work, if you like, the habit of work, the unconscious learning from older and more experienced people at work. So I think firms are going to have to tread very carefully. But if you're asking me, should the government be involved in this and actually formally start reducing the working week, my answer would be no, for a lot of the reasons that Petronella has given. But we are going to have to look at the work-life balance all over again.
Ash, I can't imagine that you work just 4 days a week. I may nominally work 4 days a week, but I usually work 7. Would a 4-day working week really work for large sectors of the economy?
Well, there was a report that came out on just this about a year ago by a think tank called Autonomy. And what it suggested was that if the public sector moved towards a 4-day working week, that not only would it create hundreds of thousands of new jobs, it would also be really beneficial to people, a better work-life balance. It would add the bulk of those new jobs to some of the poorest regions in the country, lots of red wall seats. And that also it would cost about the same as Rishi Sunak's, post-furlough job retention scheme, so it wouldn't even be that expensive. So I think that, I hear what Petronella's saying when she's saying...
I think that was quite expensive, to be fair. I mean, it's tens of billions of pounds.
So I think from the report, from how I remember reading it, and it was a while ago now, is that unlike Sunak's job retention scheme, this would add jobs to the economy. So you're taking a different approach to stimulating the economy, and you are redrawing the boundaries of the work-life balance. I hear what Petronella's saying about, well, is this a dangerous path to go down? That was exactly what was said when people were campaigning for a 5-day working week or an 8-hour working day. And the fact is that we've got technology providing, the biggest threat to our jobs in human history. The space for human labour is being closed down. And you've got to think, well, how are you going to structure the economy and structure our working lives so that that kind of technological advance won't just make us all more precarious? And I think looking seriously at policies like these, looking at how they can both stimulate the economy, add jobs, and also make our lives a bit better, I think why not?
Could I just interject? So I do think that there's another factor here, which is we are mammals. We need contact with other human beings. Yes, we are. I know from experience that I'm less productive when I'm working from home on my own. When I'm in an office, learning from people, as Michael said, when I was young, also bouncing ideas off other people, I'm not any more productive. I'm actually happier.
But on these two separate issues, you're talking about working from home, and I completely agree with you. There are costs and benefits to working from home. I get really bummed out when I'm by myself. I hate my own company. I need to be somebody else's problem.
So I love my own company.
God, I hate the sound of my own inner monologue, so I pity you guys having to put up with the sound of my voice. But
let me interrupt you, Dash. Can I just ask you about your proposal? Because you did say for the public sector, would you pay people the same, pay them the same salary for working 4 days as 5 days? Is that your proposal?
So that was the autonomy proposal, was a 4-day working week, no loss of pay. Is it mine? I say it was a report that I read. I didn't work on the report. I'm afraid I'm not a numbers person. I'm an English person.
No, but you agree with it?
I think that it's a really interesting idea, and it's worth trialling. It's certainly something that I would look at trialling in some of those really forward-thinking progressive councils, like, say, Preston, which has, pursued an entirely different model of insourcing, really, and has stimulated the local economy through doing that. I think that you may as well use some of these councils as kind of a testing ground for some of these policy ideas.
I remember this.
It out to the country.
I remember this report, and I seem to remember that John McDonnell was really championing this whole idea. And some of the research conclusions, which I must admit I had a bit of difficulty with, but the conclusion was that people produced more over 4 days than they did over 5. Now, counterintuitively, that cannot be, but that's what the research concluded. Richard?
Well, some of you may remember something called the Parkinson's Law, which was basically says that work expands to fill the time available. So you're quite right. You're not necessarily doing more work if you work for 10 hours a day than you are if you work for 8 hours a day. Looking back, Ash mentioned this, over the last couple of centuries, particularly 19th century and the early 20th century, government did interfere, did legislate to limit working hours, to bring in health and safety regulations of many different kinds. And there is a role, I think, for government and parliament to regulate work conditions. But the question, obviously, is how far does it go? I think what we're looking at is now, in the future, a kind of mixture of working from home remotely and the jobs where that can be done, and that's by no means all of them, and then working in person. But again, I agree with Petronella, actually mingling and mixing in an office, chatting by the water cooler, all of these things, that does stimulate creativity, I think. I've done some lecturing, quite a lot of lecturing remotely through Zoom, and it works fine if you have the good technicians, but it's not quite the same as sitting in a class, actually exchanging ideas and throwing ideas around spontaneously. And of course you miss things like the body language of people who are listening, and that's very important. The advantage is that you can reach many more people. So on a Zoom lecture, on live streaming, you can get people all over the world. You can get hundreds, whereas in the kind of normal university teaching, you just get a much smaller number in a classroom.
Well, it's been very interesting over the last year, all the different technical innovations. I'm sure none of us had heard of Zoom 18 months ago, yet it's transformed the things that we do. The fact that we can have two people not in the studio taking part in the programme exactly the same way. I still can't wait for the day when you can all be in the studio together, which is imminent, I feel, probably 3 weeks away. But we cope, don't we? Right, we are going to move on to another question in just a moment with our panel. 0345 6060 973. If you phone now, you will get through. We'll want to get lots more questions in before 9 o'clock. It's 8:31. Let's get the latest news headlines from Lucinda Horsley.
Nicholas. Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
So Michael Fallon, Ash Sarkar, Sir Richard Evans and Petronella Wyatt here answering your calls. 0345 6060 973. Ash, you've got a fan. Peter Clark says, whilst I rarely agree with Ash's politics, I always enjoy her argument as it always seems so heartfelt. And since Nigella's Eat, Cook and Repeat, I've been enjoying Ash's fish finger border almost every week in lockdown. Maybe Ash and her mum should write a cookbook together with politically inspired recipes. If only they had a good publisher. Do you know of any, Iain? Sadly, I'm no longer in publishing, but I'm unfamiliar with this programme that you've clearly been part of, Ash.
Oh, well, this was a recipe I tweeted a while ago, and it's one that my mum always made for me when we were kids. And it's a fish finger borta, and a borta's a traditional Bangladeshi dish. Basically, you take anything and you mash it with some mustard and some chilies, and it's divine.
Sounds like my cooking.
It is. Honestly, don't knock it till you've tried it. And it's especially good after a heartbreak. I remember I got dumped at 16 and I went through a huge Tupperware of the stuff in the fridge. It was great. So I would love to do a cookbook with my mum, but the thing that she does is, so that your cooking's never as good as her, she doesn't give you the honest recipe. So she'll leave out an ingredient and stuff like that. I'm not sure if you can sell a book.
Sneaky.
Right, let's go to a deep and meaningful question from one of our callers. It's Anthony in Staines. Hello, Anthony.
Hi, everyone. With a worrying rise in daily coronavirus cases and rising deaths today, is an early July unlocking looking more and more unlikely, and a summer lockdown looking more likely?
Michael Fallon.
Well, we just don't know at the moment. And I don't think, it'd be great to speculate, but I don't think really we can come up with definitive answers until we have the data in front of us at the point at which the government certainly would look at it all again, which I think is at least a couple of weeks away. And I think they need to do that. I think they do need to be sure that this new variant, the Delta variant, is treatable by the vaccine as the other variant, and isn't necessarily continuing to spread fast. So I do think they need to keep looking at the data. However, we were always told that this was a race between the vaccine and the variants, and more and more people are now being vaccinated and do now feel reasonably safe. And I think what the government now needs probably to move to is much more of personal responsibility, of saying to people, look, you can see the figures, you can see what some of the risks are. If you go into a crowded place and spit or shout at somebody a foot away from you, clearly that's more dangerous than sitting outside at a pub and having your meal. So I hope the government will unlock, but I hope they'll also do so by encouraging more personal responsibility and saying, look, this variant, this COVID is going to be with us for quite a long time now. We're going to have to get used to it.
Forever.
Some people are going to die from it, as they die from flu each year, sadly. But we're all going to have to take a measure of responsibility ourselves, instead of constantly saying, at what point is the government going to tell us it's totally safe, or is it still unsafe? What do you think, Anthony?
And we'll come to Anthony at the end of when I've gone to everybody else. Ash Sarkar, do you think that we might be facing another lockdown later in the year? Do you think that it is now time to lift the restrictions that we have currently?
I find it difficult to see us moving to another full-scale lockdown of the kind that we had in the winter. And the reason for that is that the vaccination rollout continues apace. You've got pretty good rates of second doses being administered, around 56% of the population. You've got more than that, of course, for first doses. And while the Delta variant provides these challenges to Pfizer and AstraZeneca's effectiveness, it's a bit like driving within the speed limit. You're safer if you do it. You're safest when everybody does it. So the higher you have the more of the population you have being vaccinated, the safer you are, even against the Delta variant. So there are lots of moving parts here. One of the things which I maybe could see happening is that there will be a trade-off between domestic freedoms, so our ability to maintain the level of unlocking we have now, and hopefully moving to even greater levels of unlocking, the end of social distancing, etc., and freedoms to travel internationally. Because that's when, in terms of, the risk to the population here, it's not just based on the percentage of people vaccinated here in the UK. It's also dependent on how many people are vaccinated abroad, because in low vaccination uptake countries, that's where you risk the emergence of new variants. So that's what I can potentially see happening, which is that we have these restrictions on foreign travel lasting a lot longer than any of us would like, but the trade-off there is greater freedoms here domestically.
Richard Evans.
Well, I'm no good at telling the future. I'm a historian. I once published a book saying that German reunification was not going to happen in my lifetime, and it came out in August 1989. So I've always been very careful since then. I think it's very interesting to see how diseases and epidemics change our behaviour. For example, it was cholera in the late 19th century that led to everybody washing their hands after going to the toilet, for example. It didn't happen before. Then we're now used to it. It seems an automatic thing to do. This may be the same with wearing masks in certain crowded situations or crowded environments. Hard to tell, really. I certainly hope, like Ash, that this is going to be a relaxation of the rules. It's very depressing living in a lockdown for well over a year, which is what I've done. I only just started coming out of the lockdown. This is my second trip to London.
Yes, you were very keen to be in the studio, not remote. I remember that when I was emailing.
Absolutely, yes. It's a kind of liberation, basically, after being, I'm very lucky. I live in the country. I can go for nice walks and that kind of stuff, but coming to London is a great thing. It's just, I had my first train journey last week since 2019. Which just shows you the effects. It's been a massive, massive change. And I think everybody is hoping that we'll come out and that the rules will be relaxed. But and it's looking as if the third wave, which we're in, is going to be less dangerous and less devastating than the first two, because we have the vaccinations, we have now lots of therapies, which are much more successful.
We also have we're getting to 100% herd immunity. And the other thing is, in a democracy, either you treat people like responsible adults or you don't. The government cannot go on indefinitely telling us what and what not to do. I mean, that's simply not viable. COVID is not going to go away, ever. There's never going to be zero COVID. There'll always be variants. And I don't believe we're the only country where the variant like the Delta variant, we just talk about it a lot more, we do more testing. The key figure is deaths, not infections. And I was speaking to the head of nursing today at St Thomas's. They haven't had anyone in ICU with COVID for months. And I think the other interesting thing is that if we go on wearing masks, that affects our immune system. There's a new report out today saying we could be overwhelmed by flu in the winter, because if your body stops building up immunity to diseases, you're much more susceptible. So you could have more people than ever before dying of flu because they've been forced to wear masks long term.
Are you worried at all, though, by the fact that in Israel today they've got another outbreak and 33% of the people who've caught the new COVID in this new outbreak have had a double vaccination? I mean, that sent a shiver down my spine.
It depends how badly they've got it. Are they in ICU?
No, they're not.
Then it doesn't send a shiver down my spine. To me, I've had 2 vaccinations. If I get it, to me, it's like the flu. I think if you've had 2 vaccinations and you get it, I do know of people who've got it again, it's like the flu. We have to live with it. And the mental and physical cost of lockdown on too many people is just too high.
Let's find out what Anthony in Staines thinks. Anthony.
Yes, going back to Michael's point about the self-responsibility, I'm a big fan of that. But the trouble is, I think we've lost that self-responsibility and we're relying too heavily on the vaccines as a panacea. That's, I think, is going to be our Achilles heel with the third wave.
OK, thank you very much indeed. We'll come back with more of your questions in a moment. It's coming up to 8.
With Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:47. Michael Fallon, Ash Sarkar, Richard Evans and Petronella Wyatt with me answering your questions. The next one is on a text from Sally in Bristol. Why would it be so bad for Channel 4 to be privatised? Ash Sarkar.
I think that where you see the privatisation of public service broadcasters, you see a decline in quality. You've got certain risks that public service broadcasters are able to take in terms of commissioning, in terms of the way in which they make media. And I think that kind of variety in the cultural environment is really key to all of us getting quality content. So I think keep it how
like
it is.
Naked Attraction.
Oh, yeah, no, that's quality. That is public service broadcasting. I've seen some amazing things that I certainly wouldn't have caught on Sky there.
Well, you're probably right in that. Whether you can say it was quality broadcasting, I don't know. We covered this earlier on the programme, and there was a suggestion that Channel 4 might be forced into a merger with ITV, where I was speculating that Naked Attraction could merge with Love Island. I mean, goodness knows, Richard Evans, what could come of that.
Don't go there, Iain. Don't go there. I think one of the great glories of British media, great British broadcasting, is the idea of public service broadcasting. I think we do it better than anybody, and certainly the BBC is a huge element in the soft power of Britain all over the world. It's the most trusted media organisation in the world. It makes mistakes, of course, sometimes things go wrong, but overall it's very important. And what I'm worried about is that a sort of slow, steady drip of reduction of public broadcasting until it gets to the position where it is in the United States, where it's just a tiny niche kind of organisation in the middle of really very poor quality commercial stations like Fox News, if I dare say it. So I do think Channel 4 is the public broadcasting arm of commercial television, and I think it should stay that way.
Okay, Petronella?
I won't say I couldn't care less, but
Clearly you couldn't.
But I do, in a way I agree with Richard and Ash. I always get irritated when politicians, particularly Tory politicians, attack the BBC for biased and jump up and down. Well, I think the BBC, yes, of course it can be biased. So can all television channels. But the BBC is a great institution. I'm in favour of public service broadcasting as well. And we do it extremely well. Yes, we get some rubbish too. But, I think it would be a pity if we went down the privatisation route.
Michael, you've always been a great fan of privatisation. Do you think Channel 4 should be privatised?
Yes, I do, actually. I want to be the odd one out here. Channel 4, I think, at the moment, it started, I think, with, great ideals of producing public service broadcasting. But it's a bit of a mixed bag now. You've got a very left-wing news element to it, and you've got some fairly rubbish programmes. You've mentioned one of them. And I don't actually think it's the ownership of the channel that decides whether it's private or public. You can get very good programming. Sky Arts, for example, a wonderful channel available on Freeview, produces some wonderful public service broadcasting. So I don't think we should get hung up on the fact that it has to be in the public sector. You can require public service broadcasting to be delivered under Ofcom by all the broadcasters, if necessary. They're already required to produce a certain amount of news content and so on. And it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man to, if you want public service broadcasting, if you want a certain amount devoted to the arts and to cultures of various kinds, low, middle brow and highbrow, to simply require that through a licensing system. I don't think you need to have a publicly owned corporation sitting right in the middle of London. I know they're now going to move to Leeds, but sitting right in the middle of London to necessarily deliver it.
Ash, that's a very fair point that Michael makes, isn't it? That, Sky Arts, the BBC could have done that. They haven't. There's the History Channel, all sorts of documentary channels on the Sky platform, none of which are publicly owned.
So I think when it comes to Channel 4, there has been a decline in the quality of its output. And I think what that reflects is a kind of risk aversion, which has dominated commissioning both in public sector broadcasting and in commercial channels. It's really hard to picture something like Brass Eye or The Day Today, those really boundary-pushing Chris Morris satires being made today. And so I do think that public service broadcasting would benefit from a shake-up. But I think that those risks, when they were taken, reflected the fact that it wasn't really having to make decisions in the same way as other commercial channels, that it could push the boundaries. And, I hear you mention Sky Arts, but about 5 people watch it, and a lot of it is very boring. The benefit of Channel 4 is that, one, it's in the slap bang in the middle of our culture. 2, there is a level, like with the BBC, of some degree of public accountability. And 3, I think that it's not about serving simply a niche audience in the same way as these, hyper-specialised commercial channels are. The point of it is that it was always supposed to serve a really broad audience, delivering all manner of content.
Yeah, but Ash, with great respect, it was introduced by a Conservative government, by the way, at a time when there were only 3 other channels. And it did add diversity then, and it did add risk-taking and a whole new dimension to television. We've got multiple channels now all over the place. It's perfectly possible to require, those channels to have more public service broadcasting of the kind that you describe without necessarily setting up a public.
Yes, but isn't everybody afraid of risk-taking across the board now? Including allegedly right-of-centre newspapers. They are, I know, because I work for them.
You can't accuse us of that, Petronella.
No.
We've got you on, we've got Ash on tonight. I don't know what bigger risk you think we could take. No, but
this is a general malaise. It's not
No, I hear what you say. Now, listen, we have got about 5 minutes to consider a very, very important subject. David in Enfield has been very patient to ask his question. Here you go, David.
Good evening, panel. The UK national debt has recently reached £2.2 trillion, and that's equivalent now to our gross national product and the highest level since World War II. 1 trillion is 1 followed by 12 zeros, 1 million. These are huge numbers, and just to put it in context, if we asked, there are 26 million households in the UK, if we asked everybody to write a cheque in an equal amount to pay off that debt, they'd all have to pay £98,000. The only redeeming feature at the moment is that interest rates are at record lows. The government can borrow for 10 years at 0.75%. Yeah, the interest bill is 48 billion a year, which is 3 times the UK police budget.
Okay, what's your question?
My question is, what measures would the panel take to restore stability to the public planning?
Right, you've literally each got 1 minute on this, which you may be relieved about. Michael?
Well, I'm with David on that. Yes, the Conservative government has got to set out a path back to financial control. They're lucky at the moment that interest rates aren't particularly high, but they could easily start rising again, and that would make servicing this debt much more expensive, taking money away from schools and hospitals. And it would also, of course, mean that our children and our grandchildren eventually will have to pay back even more. So if the Conservatives are to go on properly differentiating themselves from the other political parties, they've got to show that the magic money tree is just magic, that the real tree actually has to be paid for. I hope that's no longer than a minute.
Well done. Petronella?
I know nothing about economics, which is why I'm a writer and not a politician. But obviously, this is not a good thing. And yes, of course, because I'm also an historian. Yes, there will be a reckoning, and it will be paid by the young and future generations. Of course, there will be.
Okay, Richard?
Yes, well, I think the Conservative government has been right to spend vast sums of money on sustaining the economy, on keeping people in jobs, on fighting the pandemic. It's piled up enormous debts, but I don't think they could have done anything else. And what needs to be done now is, I'm afraid, raise taxes. That's the only way you're going to get this money back. Corporation tax on multinationals, which have managed to evade taxation in this country. And I think the G7 decision or recommendation about taxing multinationals has been an important step forward. So that's what the Conservative Party is going to have to bite the bullet and raise taxes.
Ash?
So I've got to disagree a little bit with the premise of the question, because national debt is not like a household debt. If I borrow money from the bank, I've got to pay it back within my lifetime. But we didn't finish paying off the debt incurred when the government paid off the slave owners back in the 19th century until 2015. There's a lot of latitude about over what period of time you pay things back. And the thing that I would add to that is that the austerity paradigm is dead. Look at what's going on in the United States. You've got President Biden and Janet Yellen saying that now is the time to borrow to invest in the economy, stimulate the economy by investing in infrastructure, don't take money out of it. So that's what I think we've got to do, as well as doing what Richard has suggested, which is bringing corporation tax back in line with reasonable levels, which it's certainly not at the moment. And you look at the levels of corporation tax, say, in a high innovation state like California, it's higher than ours. So I don't think that the argument either that would depress businesses and depress innovation stacks up to much scrutiny.
You've all done really well. You've been a very pliant panel so far. Let me just tell you who's going to be on the programme tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Sir Vince Cable will be joining us. Alex Salmond will be here too. Rivka Brown, I think, is a colleague of yours at Novara Media, Ash. And Dame Andrea Leadsom will be here too. So a great panel tomorrow. Right, let's finish off with a final text, which is from Olivia in Kent. It seems we're in the throes of a cardboard shortage due to our online shopping habits. If I may, what was the last thing your panellists bought online? Ash, subscription to Bumble.
Possibly mention it live on air when my mother might be listening. All I will say is that I had a great weekend.
Anyway, it's nice having you on the programme, Ash. Richard?
I'm afraid it was books.
I thought it might be. Petronella?
A safety net for a puppy, which I acquired today.
Well, my dog's 10 years old today, so I think it's a great one. Michael Fallon, can you compete with Ash there?
Well, I can't. No, it was a book again. I review books, and I was sent it, so I didn't actually have to pay for it. But yes, it was wrapped in cardboard.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Ash Sarkar, Michael Fallon, Richard Evans, and indeed Petronella Wyatt. We'll be back with Cross Question again tomorrow. You can catch up on all episodes of Cross Question on the Cross Question podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from. In a moment, we're going to return to that Education Select Committee report on why, and I want to ask why you think that white working class boys don't achieve the same results as their black counterparts. You're listening to LBC. It's 9 o'clock.
on your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the World Health Organization has expressed concern over a decision to increase capacity for the Euros final and semi-finals at Wembley to 60,000 fans. That will see the stadium